Greetings, it is time for our monthly monetary creation report, which is one of the most popular video series on this channel because this is the essence of the atom thesis and how technological deflation is exponential, and that is why quantitative easing has to also rise exponentially just to offset that technological deflation so that the two are in an equilibrium. The economics establishment does not understand this, and despite years of evidence piling up, they are unable to see these very obvious connections because it conflicts with their textbooks that are written 50 to 70 years ago, which was before the technological age, and therefore they are unable to discern the bigger picture and how most of their knowledge is obsolete. So we have this Yardeni report and we scroll down. Our first stop is this chart, which is the amount of printing by the four major central banks of the world that comprise about 90% of the world's money printing. Not all of it, but these four combined are about 90%. And in the United States, you will see a lot of inflation narrative pushers who say that the Federal Reserve is printing so much money, therefore the price of gold will rise. Now, if one country's money printing causes the price of a worldwide price commodity to rise, that does not make sense because the United States is not the only country in the world, and the United States Federal Reserve, which is the red line, was not even the largest money printer at one time. The blue, the European Central Bank, was the largest. Europe has deprinted more than the US has, so the two have converged to about the same level. But nonetheless, the United States is still only about 30% of the entire world's money printing. As we can see from this chart, Europe had done more than the United States. Japan and China are these other two. Now, since this is a worldwide metric, since technology is borderless, and therefore its connection to monetary creation is also borderless, the only measurement that matters is the sum of all of these four. And so that is the next chart after this. This chart is the sum of the four individual central banks that we saw before, as we can see here. Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and People's Bank of China. And the grand total is $27.6 trillion, which is down a good $4 trillion or so from the peak. Now, as you can see here, this is an exponential parabola because it is matching the percentage of the total economy that is high-tech and therefore releasing a calculable amount of technological deflation into the economy. Those two numbers match up. That is why it's easy to predict what quantitative easing has to rise to. This misguided quantitative tightening, reversal of money printing, is already to the tune of $4 trillion plus. And if you look at this trend line and you see that we should be over here by now, you can see that we are 6 to 7 trillion behind where we should be already. And if the central banks of the world were to catch up by, say, the end of 2024, they would have to get to 10 trillion more than where they are now. Now, I won't predict exactly what the grand total will be on a certain date, but suffice it to say this trend line has to sustain itself, and it also has to be more diffuse, which I'll talk about later in this video. So this tightening is very misguided and will cause a stock market crash and a recession, which forces the central banks of the world to print more money again, because that has already happened a number of times in the past. In 2018, they started to tighten, and then there was a major market correction at the end of 2018. They had to print more money again. Then they had to print more again after that. Partly because of COVID-19, but it would have happened anyway without COVID-19 because all the other indicators were already pointing towards a need for more money printing. Now they think they have to reverse it again. They think they have to reverse all of this, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. That is so misguided that it is crazy, but they never revise their beliefs because PhD economists are incentivized to merely repeat what they read in textbooks that were written 70 years ago. They're effectively the flat earthers of modern economics. Now, what is the gradient of this growth rate? For that, we go to the next chart. This is the same chart as the one above, except that it's the percentage year-over-year growth rate of the world's cumulative monetary creation total. And I say this always has to be within a band of 16 to 24% a year. And usually it just gets to the lower end of that band, but it's often below that band because these central banks are always trying to undo the money printing that they believe is the unnatural element, whereas I say it is very natural, and the act of trying to undo that is in fact the act of trying to fight gravity, so to speak. And they had to do a lot of QE in response to COVID-19, where the year-over-year growth rate got all the way up to 46.3%. That is a level at which even I say there might be some excessive inflation for a short while, but we saw very little of that even at this level of 46.3, and now they're over-tightening. Their tightening has led to a year-over-year growth rate of minus 10.4%. Minus 10.4% is very wrong relative to this trend that we've already seen for over a decade. And as we saw, they are several trillion dollars behind. And just to revert back to the normal band, they would have to again change direction and get back to over here. That is very extensive. And the process by which the central banks are arm twisted into doing the right thing will not be pretty. These are recessions that don't need to happen. There are many videos on this channel about exactly how these PhD economists are damaging your future. For example, look at this video up here in this card as just one example, and there's many others. Now we scroll down a bit further to this important chart, because in the United States, the extent to which the threat of inflation and the extent of inflation is exaggerated is really quite cartoonish. People make out inflation to be a terrible thing, thereby implying that deflation would be good. Nothing would be further from the truth. Deflation would be much worse for your well-being than inflation, as I describe in this video up here. But not only do they claim that deflation would be good, they also overstate the extent of inflation, as we will see in part 2 of this video. The United States, the red line, is actually the lowest of the 4 central banks when you account for the amount of money printing in proportion to the size of the GDP of that country. Now, I said earlier that only the worldwide total of monetary creation matters, and that is the truth. But to see which country has printed a lot versus printed a little is very revealing, and contrary to the narrative that you're hearing in the mainstream media. The United States is the joint lowest of the 4, along with the People's Bank of China. Only 32%, 34% of its GDP has been printed over multiple years. And remember, GDP is an annual metric, whereas this cumulative money printing amount is over 15 years, let's say. And the blue line, the European Central Bank, is twice as high as the United States' amount of money printing. You would think that Germans are the people most afraid of money printing because in the 1930s, printing a lot of money caused inflation. But that cannot happen in the 2020s. The 1930s differ from the 2020s by just as much as the first millennium differed from the 1930s. And that is not an exaggeration if you understand the accelerating rate of technological change. But even the amount of money printing by the European Central Bank, which is twice as much as what the United States has done in proportion to the size of the domestic economy of each entity in question, the real champion of money printing is Japan. They have printed 4 times as much as the United States as a percentage of GDP, which amounts to 129.4% of Japan's GDP printed. And nobody claims that Japan has aberrantly high inflation. And that is why a lot of these people who still think the Federal Reserve printing money causes inflation, they just don't understand what's going on, because they are unable to explain why Japan can print so much without any inflation. Now, we know why, I explained why. But they cannot. They say the United States is printing money and therefore gold will go up, ignoring how many other countries have printed much more as a percentage of their economy than the United States, with Japan being the example that really breaks their set of assumptions. It's very absurd to say that printing money causes inflation, because they believe that printing money means that more money is chasing the same amount of goods. More money is chasing more goods, and a greater percentage of those goods are software oriented. And software does not run out of supply. When the demand for a software product dramatically increases, there's no inventory shortage or shipping bottleneck or supply chain limitation. A software company can sell an unlimited number of new copies of its software. Consider a streaming service like Netflix, for example, or a video game that is available via download. That is why there's not inflation when money is printed, because money printing means more money is pursuing more goods, and a greater percentage of those goods are software relative to the pre-technological age. Pre-2010 even, you could say. So that is how to look at monetary creation in relation to GDP, and how much has to be done just to offset the exponential rise of technological deflation across the economy. Now let's look at our 2020 scorecard. So I show this scorecard every month because it depicts what was done in the 2010s and what all the PhD economists, the economics establishment, thought the 2020s would result in. $23 trillion were printed in the 2010s, and the economists think that $23 trillion will still be reversed, and they assume that would occur over the 2020s, and they still think that. So their prediction for the amount of money printing that is to occur in the 2020s is minus $23 trillion, effectively reversing the first $23 trillion. Whereas I said the amount of money printing that has to be done in the 2020s, which is a prediction I made on January 1st, 2020, as many people who read my blog, The Futurists, know, as well as you can see from earlier videos on this channel, was 50 to 100 trillion. 100 trillion if it is done in the form of bond buying, treasuries and mortgage-backed securities like they're doing now. Of course, that method is saturating, as I describe in other videos, and they have to migrate towards sending cash directly to people. And the amount of dollars needed under a more diffuse and granular method like that is less, so 50 trillion in that case. That's why I say over here, 50 trillion if cash, 100 trillion if bond buying. So what has happened as of November 23rd, 2022, which is already 3 years into this 10-year window of time from January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2029. Almost 3 years, so almost 30% of this period. It's still plus 7.7 trillion. So despite the several trillion dollars of reverse printing they have done, they are still 7.7 trillion more than they were on January 1st, 2020. Now, if this is how much has been done in the first 3 years, which of the two predictions is more on track? Theirs of minus 23 trillion or mine of 50 to 100 trillion in the positive? Well, mine, of course, and remember, this is exponential, not linear. In the first 30% of the time series, you wouldn't expect 30% of all printing. You would expect a lot less than 30% of the printing because it is exponential. That's why the 2000s saw virtually zero, the 2010s saw 23 trillion, and the 2020s will naturally see 50 to 100 trillion as part of that exponential progression. The 2030s will have numbers that seem immense by today's standards, but we'll talk about that in other videos. Now, how much inflation does this level of quantitative easing actually cause? A lot less than you may think. To study that, we go to part 2 of this video. This is our monthly inflation scorecard update that I do every month. You can see that I have maintained my traditional matrix of multidimensional inflation measurement. Don't just look at the US CPI and don't just look at 1 year. You have to look long term and you have to look at worldwide metrics that trade freely, because people claim that the US CPI is rigged so that the US government understates inflation. That's just complete garbage. Anyone who thinks that is very innumerate, as I can prove in 10 different ways. And I say that optimal inflation is 3%. If you've reached the point of watching a channel like this, hopefully you're past the point where you know that it's not as simple as inflation is bad and deflation is good, and you want deflation because you will get rich if there's deflation. That is absurd. If you're still at that point, then you have to watch a lot of videos on this channel to get past that type of programming. But I say that the US CPI 10 years compound annual growth rate has to be above 3%. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, the most important measurement of the three, has to have a 10-year compound annual growth rate above 3%. And the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield also has to be above 3% at a given time for inflation to be higher than optimal. Remember, this is not the red zone above which inflation is immediately at a crisis level. This is optimal. Too far below this is not enough, because that means that the liquidity in the world is insufficient to offset technological deflation, and there is not enough inflation to act as fuel for technology. Remember, ultimately, inflation is fuel for technological progress. To a point. That's why I say 3% is optimal. I'm not saying it should be higher than that because that would be more fuel. No, there's such a thing as too much fuel, as well as leaving the least fortunate and least technologically adapted people behind. So 3% is the best of all worlds within those various trade-offs. So let's look at what all three of these measurements are today on November 13th, 2022. First, we look at the US CPI, and this is the BLS.gov website, which I'll have in the description box below. And this is how we see the US CPI 10-year compound annual growth rate. So here's the chart of a rising CPI, but this does have to be a parabola, because remember, this is a linear vertical axis. A straight line would mean less percentage increases each year. That's not what we want. So the 10-year compound annual growth rate is represented by 298 divided by the number exactly 10 years prior, which is 231. So that is 298 divided by 231, which is 29% inflation. That's 29% inflation over 10 years. Not a single year, over 10 years. Therefore, the 10th root of that is what it would be for an average compound annual growth rate for those 10 years. So we take the 10th root, x to the y power of 0.1. I hope everyone understands the arithmetic of this. And that gives us 1.02579, rounded up to 2.6. minus 1 times 100, so 2.579% inflation is the compound annual growth rate. We can round up the decimal point to 2.6%. Now, inflation, even in the US CPI, is already moderating, because we scroll down, we see this 1 month percentage growth rate, and it's already passed its initial flurry and back down to its long-term equilibrium state. The 2-month growth rate also back down to its long-term equilibrium state. So too for the 3-month growth rate. Even the 6-month percentage change is halfway down to its equilibrium state. And now we get to the only measurement that the media tells you matters, which is the 1-year rate. That's already peaking and on its way back down. Now here's the funny thing. The CPI as measured in all time frames less than 1 year is showing that inflation has returned back to a stable equilibrium and is not high. And all measurements longer than a year also show that it's not high. I take the 10-year rate to smooth out all these little fluctuations. And as we saw, that is 2.6%. So the media will tell you, oh, inflation is 7.8%, as if a 12-month window is the only one that ever matters. The same shameful people will be nowhere to be found when this is back down again to a low level. It was close to zero, approaching deflation in early 2020. And in 2015, in fact, for the entire calendar year of 2015, none of these people were screaming then. They were nowhere to be found. So don't listen to the media on these matters. Now we go to the next measurement, which is the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, this website will be in the description box below as well, of course. And this is at 0.16%, 10-year compound annual growth rate. You can choose any time frame window, and the 10-year compound annual growth rate is close to zero, nowhere near 3%. I claim that the technomic medium of the world has overtaken the entire commodities complex, and commodities cannot rise at an inflationary level at all anymore. Even when Russia invaded Ukraine, that caused oil to rise to $120 a barrel for a short while. And now it's back below 100 again. The adaptations around any commodity shortage are so sophisticated now because of the atom, the technomic medium of the world, that commodity shortages get mitigated right away. That's why gold and silver are not rising at all. They're the same price as 10 or 12 years ago. People who believe gold and silver will rise because the Federal Reserve printed money, at what point will they give up? The central banks of the world have printed a lot in the last 10 years, and none of that has caused gold and silver to rise. Do you know why? Because people who don't understand either technology or free market economics, they believe that when you print money, that means more money is chasing the same amount of goods. In reality, that just means that more money is chasing more goods, and more of those new goods are software oriented. That is why you can print a lot of money with very little inflation, and that elasticity is rising because more and more of the economy is becoming knowledge-based. Software, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, IP, nanotechnology, all those things are very knowledge-oriented and do not have inventory and factories and productions and supply chains. Therefore, their supply can increase very quickly. Now, you have to be a Luddite that has not paid attention to the last 70 years of economic progress to still believe that printing a lot of money causes inflation, and then be in denial of the new reality and then say, whoa, inflation measurements are rigged because it's actually much higher than all the data indicates. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index is made of items that are freely traded and worldwide. Oil, gold, natural gas, silver, palladium, whatever you think about as a commodity is freely traded, is priced worldwide, and there is virtually no growth over 10 years. In fact, it's quite often in deflation. Now we go to the third measurement, which is the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, and this is at 3.81%, so it's the only one of those three measurements that is actually above 3%. Now, as you can see here, it took a lot of resistance to get above 3%. It kept attacking it in June and July, but it couldn't quite break the 3% mark. It required the Federal Reserve to make extreme Fed funds rate height increases, quantitative tightening, as well as speed up the rate of deprinting of money, quantitative tightening, by selling back the treasuries and mortgage-backed securities that they had bought during COVID. They should not be doing that, as I explained in many videos on this channel, but now it's finally broken above 3%, but it's at 3.81 right now. The pressure on the economy and the housing market can be measured by the area enclosed by a shape that has this 3% mark as the boundary and then this line as the rest of the shape, and as this area rises, therefore it's a function of the time it spends above 3%, as well as the extent of distance above 3%. The increase in area of this shape represents how much cumulative pressure is building on the housing market and the U.S. Treasury market, meaning the U.S. federal government's spending flexibility, and how there could be a correction and a financial crisis if this is allowed to get too high. Then the Federal Reserve will print money again, not realizing that they caused a situation that they are now again trying to mitigate. They don't understand how they keep swinging between these extremes and get it wrong each time. They overdo it in both directions, as we know. So back to my matrix. So we looked at all three: the US CPI 10-year compounded growth rate, Goldman Sachs Commodity Index 10-year compounded growth rate, and the 10-year US Treasury yield. So what are these numbers as of November 13th, 2022, which is today, as we saw? 2.6% for the US CPI 10-year compounded growth rate, 0.16%, so virtually zero, for the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. Again, the most important of the three, because commodity prices directly relate to people spending more for the same thing. Services prices make it more ambiguous, because if the price of a service rose, then someone's wages also rose. So it's bad for the buyer but good for the seller. So calculating inflation in the entire economy is harder for service prices. Plus, the commodity index is worldwide and freely traded. It is by far the most robust measurement of the three. And the 10-year US Treasury yield is the only one above 3%, 3.81%. Remember, I say that all three have to be above 3% for inflation to be a problem. At the moment, only one is above 3%, the other two are not, and one of those two is far from it. So until all three get above 3%, there is not too much money printing. Yet they are tightening right now, and they're about to cause an economic and fiscal crisis in the U.S. as well as other parts of the world, because the central banks of the world are tightening, even though inflation was not high enough for them to tighten. It is truly crazy how out of date their thinking is. They continue to overshoot on each side. It's almost like instead of feeding a normal person proper food and of the right type, they overfeed someone, then induce vomiting, then they overfeed someone, then they induce vomiting. That is what the Federal Reserve is doing to the economy. It's really quite insane, because these PhD economists are very theoretical people, and they never face any consequences for being wrong again and again and again. Their own jobs are government jobs, especially at the Federal Reserve, and therefore they don't lose their jobs in a recession, so they never face the consequences of the problems they create for everyone else. How is that a fair system? I've long said that we would have much, much, much better and more informed and more real-time monetary policy if they fired all 600 PhDs at the Federal Reserve and instead just had 100 small business owners across the U.S. dial in each week to cast their vote on monetary policy. None of them even have to be full-time. They don't even need to be paid more than a basic amount of money for their services. But they should just cast their vote on monetary policy, 100 of them, and whatever the consensus is what monetary policy should be. They would have a much, much, much better outcome than these 600 PhDs at the Federal Reserve, who are so theoretical that to them it's just a video game. And the number of PhDs doesn't increase the quality of decision making, because they've all memorized the same textbooks. Therefore, having 600 PhDs is no better than having one PhD, and having one PhD is worse than having 0 PhDs working at the Federal Reserve. Anyway, this was the inflation update, and if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much for watching.